Hello, I'm Matthew Jarron, Museum Curator at the University of Dundee and Coordinator of the Public Art Dundee project, and welcome to the latest in my series of virtual public art walks. And for this one, we're back in the city centre. This is the third city centre tour that I've done, although you don't need to have seen the other two in order to enjoy this one. And this time we're starting at the McManus, the main city museum, and we're going to do a wee loop and end back where we started. So the first thing to point out is the nice wee statue of Urwally that's sitting outside the McManus here. This was created in 2016 by the artist Malcolm Robertson, who also did the Jute Women that's in Lochee. And it was a commission from the City Council with some financial support from DC Thomson. And sadly, this kind of got overlooked at the time, really because it actually ended up getting installed at much the same time as the temporary Urwally Big Bucket Trail was all around Dundee. And so, of course, that grabbed all the attentions. And this permanent Urwally that, of course, will be here for hopefully long after all those temporary Urwallys are long forgotten, sadly hasn't really had the same attention, unfortunately. But he's rather nice, and one thing to note is that there's a whole story around it, which is that he's pinched PC Murdoch's helmet, and he's kind of hidden it nearby, so you have to go and try and find it. But I'm not going to tell you where it is. Now, we're just going to temporarily deviate down Chapel Street and round to the back of the Keeler Shopping Centre. And I'll have to cut to a photo of this because unfortunately the shutter is up so you can't see it properly. But there's a very colourful mural by an Italian-born Barcelona-based artist called El Ruggi. This was created in 2018 as part of an exchange scheme called Hit the Wall, organised by a group called Wallspot. This is basically a kind of street art exchange whereby El Ruggi came to Dundee from Barcelona and Seagull ended up going to Barcelona to work over there. The Dundee end of it was sponsored by the Keeler Shopping Centre and was organised by Open Close Dundee. And it was inspired by Japanese robots that were very popular in comics in the 1980s. Right, back out into Albert Square. We're just going to go round the McManus, and before we come on to look at the next statue, one other thing to point out is the very splendid Royal Exchange building that you can see here has some quite fancy carving on it. You'll see, for example, some gargoyles up the top here. This was built in 1855, by the way, by the architect David Bryce. So Google's done that hilarious thing again where they've actually blurred his face so you can't recognise him. But we know who he is because it's written down there. So this is James Carmichael, a very notable engineer. Carmichael and his brother ran the Dundee Iron Workers, James Carmichael and Company, and his invention of this device that he's actually sat on here, the fan blast, completely revolutionised the casting of iron. And famously, he offered this device free to the world rather than patenting it and making a fortune. Some might say more fool him, but of course this did allow a huge transformation of iron casting all around the world. And ever since he died in 1853, there had been calls to have some kind of memorial. But it wasn't really until the British Association came to Dundee in 1867 that somebody read a paper about Carmichael's work, and that reawakened public interest. And really from that point, there was sort of growing interest in trying to do something. And finally, in 1873, a committee were able to actually commission the Edinburgh-based sculptor John Hutchison to create this statue. And it was unveiled in 1876, and apparently one of his former employees, on seeing the statue, cried out, "That is my late master minus the breath." So here we have, of course, the statue of Queen Victoria. And this was, in fact, the last of the Victorian-era statues to appear in Dundee. And it was initially commissioned as part of the celebrations of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And the hope was that it would be ready in time for that in 1897. And the commission went to an English sculptor, Harry Bates. Unfortunately, Bates was quite ill at the time and indeed subsequently died before the finished statue could be unveiled. And he only managed to have a plaster copy of it ready in time for the Diamond Jubilee celebrations. Now, this statue was controversial for a number of reasons. One was that nobody could decide where to put it. So the preferred option was actually to have it in front of the high school. And that was where the plaster copy was placed in 1897. But a lot of people thought that that disrupted the view of the high school from Reform Street, and they weren't very pleased on that. There were various other suggestions, having it in front of the city churches, in front of the townhouse. Somebody who didn't like it said it should be on top of the law where nobody could see it. And eventually the decision was taken to put it here at the side of the Albert Institute, really because it was the only site that nobody could object to. It wasn't that anybody actually particularly wanted it to be there. That was just it was the least worst option. The other main controversy was actually about the design of the statue itself. And there were two complaints. One was actually about the frieze that's at the base here. So there are 4 different panels here representing scenes from the Queen's lengthy reign. And most people thought that these should be depicting great events, like the coronation, for example. But some people felt that actually they should show more private acts of kindness. So, for example, the Queen visiting wounded soldiers from the Crimea. And in the end, Bates actually tried to appease both camps by having 2 public scenes and 2 private scenes. So it's got her marriage to Albert, her visit to Dundee, visiting the wounded soldiers, and also reading the Bible at the bedside of a poor Highland woman. But the other thing was the actual design of the Queen herself, because a lot of people questioned that this was not exactly an idealised portrait of the Queen. And it raised a whole issue about what was the point of public sculpture. Was it to depict people as they actually are, or was it to depict people as you would like them to be? And a lot of people felt that, particularly for our noble Queen, that this should be an idealised portrait of wonderful nobility and regality, rather than this rather fat, dumpy old woman, which is how Bates depicted her. So there's a lot of controversy about that. But of course that raised this whole issue, and there was a huge debate at the time about what the nature of public art was. That was actually really interesting. So as I say, at the time that Bates finally completed the statue, they still hadn't actually decided where it was going to sit. And so the statue arrived by train, and they didn't have anywhere to put it. So the Queen had to sit in a left luggage office for about 2 weeks before eventually they decided to have her in this spot. And eventually she was unveiled in 1899, as I say, just a few months after, sadly, Harry Bates died. Okay, here we have another fuzzed out figure. So this is, again, the base will tell us here, this is George Kinloch, the so-called radical laird. So this was the first statue to appear around the Albert Institute. And again, it was one that had been talked about for many years. So George Kinloch famously was a radical politician who had been forced to flee the country after giving a famously inflammatory speech on Magdalen Green in 1819, condemning the Peterloo massacre in Manchester and advocating the rights of working men. Now, in fact, what he was asking for was fairly straightforward, like the fact that people should actually be able to vote for the people that were in government. But these were radical thoughts at that time, and he was basically forced to flee the country because otherwise he would have been arrested for sedition. Finally, when the Reform Act of 1832 changed the voting system and massively increased the size of the electorate, Kinloch was returned as Dundee's first MP in the newly reformed Parliament, but sadly he died the following year. And ever since then, there had been calls to have some kind of monument in his honour. And there were various different suggestions, one of which actually was to have a library and museum named after him. So we could have had the Kinloch Institute rather than the Albert Institute. But eventually, in 1863, it was decided that it would take the form of a statue. Initially, decided that this would go in front of the townhouse, but the town council didn't own the land, so they couldn't do that. And eventually it was agreed that it could be placed in the grounds of the Albert Institute. Now, a committee was formed to organise this, chaired by a local builder, James Sturrock. And eventually they decided to go to John Steele. Steele, although born in Aberdeen, had actually grown up in Dundee, felt a very close affinity to Dundee. He'd already done the statue of Sir David Baxter in Baxter Park. And because of his close family connections, he could always be relied upon to knock a bit off his fee, as he did in this case. Now, again, there was trouble over the site. Although they'd agreed that this is where the statue would go, the town council were responsible for erecting the plinth that he stands on, which you can see here. And the plinth was erected sometime before the statue was actually completed. Now, the idea is that Kinloch is depicted in the act of giving his address on Magdalen Green. But there was a difference of opinion as to which way he should actually face in order to give this address. Now, the town council had obviously decided that he was giving his address to the people, and so he should be facing the street. And so here he is, as you can see, facing out onto the street. But the Kinloch Committee felt that because his address was an attack on the government, he should be facing the nearest government building, which actually was the post office, which at that time was where DC Thomson's now is. So they wanted the statue facing that way, but of course the pedestal was already plonked facing that way. Now, shortly before the statue was due to be erected, in the middle of the night, some mysterious people came along and shifted the pedestal to face towards the post office. And of course, nobody owned up to this, but it was later discovered that the people that carried it out were actually employees of James Sturrock, the convener of the committee. So it was pretty obvious that this was the committee trying to sneakily get him facing the way that they wanted. And there was then a whole kind of debate in the press as to which way he should face. I think one article suggested that they put him on a moving pedestal and then they could shift him back and forward as they liked. But in the end, just I think a day or two before the statue actually got erected, the pedestal was returned to its position. So he is facing the people rather than attacking the government. But there you go. While we're here, just want to point out the old Congregational Church building here, which again has some nice decorative carving on it. So you can see the little faces there on opposite side of the window, for example. This is another David Bryce building, again from about the same time, 1855. Right, so here we have a rather seagull-splattered statue of Robert Burns. Now, the Burns statue has a slightly more complicated origin than the other ones that we've looked at. The idea originally started not in Dundee, but in New York. So in 1872, there was a group of American Scots who had commissioned John Steele to execute a statue of Sir Walter Scott for Central Park. And they suddenly discovered that they had money to spare at the end of this. And the reason for that is that Steele had actually offered them the statue half price because it was a replica of the one he'd just made for the Scott Monument in Edinburgh. And so, having all this money spare, they thought, wouldn't it be nice if some people back home in Scotland could reap the same benefit and they could basically purchase another statue half price. So they decided to use the money to commission a new sculpture from Steele of Robert Burns, and then offer somewhere in Scotland the chance to buy a half-price copy, just as they had done with the Scot. So they discussed this with Steele, and Steele suggested Dundee would be the ideal place. And so this was all agreed, and Steele offered the copy of the Central Park statue that he created, half price, although it still cost over 1,000 guineas. So again, public subscription, raised the money, helped by a significant donation by the Dundee Burns Club. But again, there was a lot of controversy as to the actual design of the statue. Now, Steele had chosen to depict Burns on the anniversary of his famous Highland Mary's death. He's gone out to meditate in the fields, he's gazing heavenward, and suddenly he gets the inspiration to write his poem, Mary in Heaven. But the way that Steele has depicted this is in a very kind of casual, informal way. So he's kind of lounging, he's got his legs crossed, he's sort of gazing upwards. And this is not how, Victorian statues were meant to be. You're meant to be standing upright, straight, or, seated very formally. There were kind of rules about what you did and didn't do in sculpture, and Steele was being very radical in breaking those rules. And so a lot of people really didn't like this. And, they complained that he was really staring really awkwardly and it looked like he got a crick in his neck and so on. So, interestingly, Steele later on made further copies of the statue for London and Dunedin in New Zealand. And he actually altered the design so that Burns is actually looking more forwards rather than upwards. But actually, I don't think it looks as good. So at the time, this was, quite a radical piece of sculpture. But it arguably counts as the most popular piece of public art ever in Dundee, because when it was unveiled, over 20,000 people turned up, crammed into Albert Square to try and see the unveiling. Famously, William McGonagall tried to clamber onto the platform to recite an ode and hastily was kicked off. But it does sound like an absolutely extraordinary event. So here we have the mighty D.C. Thomson Building, built between 1902 and 1905, very much modelled on kind of big American press buildings. And it has this very, very splendid pediment carving on the entrance here by the Glasgow sculptor Albert Hodge, featuring these statues of literature and justice, and then a globe in the middle there. It's a really fantastic piece of carving, and some lovely ironwork on the balcony above it there. So another building that's absolutely covered in incredibly rich decorative carving is the old post office building. Really, really grand building. Built between 1895 and 98 by the architect Walter Robertson. We don't know who did the carving, I'm afraid, but obviously these very splendid angels. Incredibly rich decorative design all over there. And really all over the whole building. So, here's various fancy heads there. And there's more around the side as well. Again, you see a whole series of heads along the wall there, and various other fine carvings as well. It is an incredibly grand building, really indicative of how important post offices were in those days. Now we have another very grand building here. What's now the McManus Collections Unit was built as the Barrack Street reading rooms and library. So initially the main central library was in the Albert Institute, what's now the McManus, but then moved here in 1911. And again, Albert Hodge was commissioned to create decorative carving with some angels with blurry faces here, and all sorts of detail on the pediment there. Here's another very grand building that has seen better days. This is the old Foresters' Halls, which sadly are all boarded up now. Of course, for many years this is where Dundee Rep Theatre had their home. And rather lovely carving on the front here, which of course very helpfully gives us the date, 1901. These were designed by the architect David Baxter. Just want to point out this interesting little exhibition space here. This is a little space called Nomas Projects, where there's basically 5 windows, and they produce these tiny little mini exhibitions curated by David McCulloch, aka Cully, and so there's always something really interesting going on in them. So another rather splendid public building here, although rather less splendid because it used to have a huge great spire on the top of it with another big statue which was removed at some point. This is the City Gymnasium, built in 1891. And this is one of the few examples where we do, like the various Albert Hodge ones, we do know who did the sculpture. So it has this rather splendid tympanum. So when you get carving inside a pediment like this, it's called a tympanum. So there you go, that's your word of the day, very useful for crosswords. And so this rather splendid piece was designed by James E.D. Reid and executed by James Bremner, both notable Dundee artists. James E.D. Reid later went down to England and became very famous, mostly as a stained glass designer. Bremner stayed in Dundee and was the first person to teach sculpture at the Technical Institute, what ultimately became Duncan of Jordanson College of Art and Design. Right, we're just going to whiz along to the end of Ward Road now. Right, so on the corner here we have this interesting 2-part artwork. So this is called Scrambling Burst. I'll just zoom into this bit of it here. And this was created in 1994 by the artists Chris Biddlecombe and Chris Kelly, aka Sight Insight. And it was the result of a limited competition that was held by the Dundee Public Art Programme in collaboration with Duncan of Jordanson College of Art as one of a number of commissions that they created to celebrate their centenary in 1992, even though that wasn't actually their centenary, but that's a whole other story. So it basically marks the fact that the Scrambling burn runs underneath the ground here and was the source of water that powered all of the mills in the local area. And so it's like a kind of water derrick with water gushing out of the top of it. And then, as well as that, there's also this kind of wheel tap thing here, which was really created as a seat, although I'm not sure anybody ever actually sits on it. And here is one of these enormous mills that fed off the Scrambling burn. This is Tay Works, and has again another very splendid tympanum in the pediment there. This dates, as you can see, to 1865. Unfortunately, I don't know the architect of this building, but famously this, and you can see it goes on and on and on. This is apparently the longest mill facade in Europe, so I've been told. And there's another one here, which again has the city coat of arms on it. It's probably the single most commonly sculpted thing in Dundee. Now, we're just briefly going to head up to the roundabout here so that we can take a look at the Bobbin here. So this was designed by the artist Adrian McStay and was made at the Rathbuyers Forge by P. Johnson and Company. And it was designed in 2010 and commissioned as a Percent for Art project from the Opal Property Group and Abertay University, who were building these new student flats that you see behind here. So it's meant to represent a jute bobbin, and there are 498 individual glass beads in the design, and that's because there are 498 student flats in the hall of residence behind. Let's go round the roundabout the wrong way, just because we have the power to do that on Google Streetview. Right, we'll just head back down this way. So here we have the Police War Memorial, this rather fine Celtic cross here. Don't know who designed or built it, unfortunately, but it was erected in 1922. And then another very splendid public building here, the Sheriff Court, and again a very grand tympanum inside the pediment with the lion and unicorn there. And this was this whole neoclassical facade was added to the building in 1863 by the architect William Scott. The original building was built 30 years before that. Again, it's rather the worse for wear, but this building here was once the Kerr Night Refuge, so Doss House basically, and it has this rather lovely tympanum carving on the pediment here saying, "I was a stranger and ye took me in." And that building was by Ireland McLaren from 1881, but it's really badly worn, unfortunately. And so we're now at Abertay University. And unfortunately this is as close as we can get into it, but on the windows here, I'll have to cut to some photos because you can't see it here at all. There's a nice glass design using vinyl that was done by Imogen Scott in 2011. Now, this very splendid building here is the old college building of Abertay when it was Dundee Technical College and School of Art. And it has this very grand frontage here. So this was designed by the architects James Langlands and Robert Gibson and built in 1908 to 9. And I wonder whether this very gorgeous carving in the pediment here might be designed by Thomas Delgatti Dunn, who was the first head of the art school. Now, of course, Duncan Johnson College of Art and Design. But it's really rather gorgeous. And there's another head sort of looking down on you as you go in, which is rather nice. Okay, just going to head back down this way. So I'm just going to head down Constitution Road. So first of all, pointing out the old Dundee Savings Bank here, which, unfortunately there's a lamppost in the way, has yet another coat of arms on it. This was 1867 by the architect James McLaren. On the other side of the road we have what's now the Congregational Church, the old Ward Chapel, And this is a much earlier building. This is James Brewster, 1833, and it has various carvings on it, including these two kind of grotesque heads here. This guy's particularly angry for some reason. And then here we have the Margaret Harris building, the girls' high school, which again is one of these buildings that's just absolutely covered in decoration, and probably can't see it all that well from this angle, but all of these pediments have carvings in them. So if we go around to the main front of the building, you can see again this very splendid facade. These nice little foliage details next to the windows, more carving in all the pediments here, and a very splendid tympanum above the door, and this large head as well. And so this building was designed by the architects Alexander McCulloch and J.G. Fairley in 1886. Right, and just the last thing to point out is just on the wall of the high school, just below the window here, there's a plaque commemorating a former pupil of the high school called David Anderson, which was installed in 1964. And Anderson was an engineer who worked on the Forth Road Bridge project. I don't know who, unfortunately, designed it. Right, and so that's our final piece of art. And here we are back at the McManus where we started. So, hope you found that interesting, and look out for more of these tours coming soon. Bye for now.